It's Game Boy World, and this is the Sword of Hope. Americans lived in fearful distrust of Japan in the 1980s. Here was this country that we'd bombed with vicious weapons wielding power never before witnessed by human eyes at the end of World War II, and a mere 4 decades later, there they were steamrolling the rest of the world on the strength of their clockwork corporate culture. And rad electronics. Japan was terrifying, and the Sword of Hope demonstrates why. No, there was no danger of Kemco Seika's Game Boy RPG Coom adventure game snatching up our precious resources or putting American factory workers out of a job. The Sword of Hope wasn't going to start purchasing franchises belonging to America's favorite pastime either. On its surface, it was wholly benign. But the Sword of Hope demonstrates in a nutshell what Japan did so well at the pinnacle of its bubble economy throughout the 80s. Synthesis. Taking new ideas and creations from other cultures, then reworking them into something newer, fresher, more inventive. We've already seen Kemco in Game Boy World back in episode 9. That game, the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle, was nothing whatsoever like the Sword of Hope. Still, it's not hard to draw a line between the two and decipher what makes Sword of Hope so interesting. The Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle was, like many Kemco releases of the era, built around Western properties. Despite the companies having spun off of a Japanese engineering corporation, it built much of its success on Western games and licenses. In fact, Kemco's first ever video game release was a Famicom conversion of Synapse Software's Commodore 64 shooter Doughboy, and in the following years they converted properties like Spy vs. Spy, Superman, and Peanuts to Famicom as well. The Crazy Castle series, which revolved around American cartoon properties, like Roger Rabbit, Bugs Bunny, Mickey Mouse, and even Woody Woodpecker, became one of the company's mainstays. Kemco often looked to Europe as well, such as with their Super NES port of Infogrames' RPG Draken, and their frequent releases of Gremlin Graphics' Top Gear series. But NES fans probably know Kemco best for translating ICOM's MacVenture games to the system. Beginning with SHADOWGATE, Kemco basically introduced an entire generation of gamers to graphical adventures, and that's where the Sword of Hope comes in. You don't have to look hard to see the similarities in layout and structure between SHADOWGATE and Deja Vu and the Sword of Hope. Both those games and the Sword of Hope play out as point-and-click adventures, with the current world view windowed at the upper left of the screen, character status information to its right, and a series of commands or other information scrolling up along the bottom. Even the movement system, which consists of selecting an exit from the overhead minimap, resembles SHADOWGATE's. But despite its evidently having been built on the bones of ICOM's games, there's no mistaking the Sword of Hope for a MacVenture title. Within its graphical adventure, trappings beats the heart of a Japanese console RPG. At some point along the way, it seems Kemco's designers decided to rework ICOM's adventures into something more palatable to Japanese audiences. Maybe it seemed like a natural evolution for them, or maybe Kemco's designers were simply stung by the fact that their conversion of SHADOWGATE has a reputation among Japanese gamers for being total garbage. Who knows? Whatever the case, Sword of Hope eschews the environmental puzzles of ICOM's games in favor of turn-based combat. While you need to figure out where to use key items, and examining everything in sight remains crucial to progression, the Sword of Hope falls back on character levels and magic spells and semi-random combat to provide a rather unique gaming experience. The most likely predecessor to this game would probably be Falcom's Tombs and Treasures, which was released for NES in 1991, but originally debuted on Japanese home computers in 1988, just enough time for Kemco to take some inspiration. The only other similar game that comes to mind is Sting's Riviera: The Promised Land for Game Boy Advance and PSP, but that was more of a visual novel, whereas this is definitely cut from the cloth of the graphical adventure genre. Despite its iconoclasm though, the Sword of Hope's design makes a lot of sense. After all, the definitive Japanese RPG Dragon Quest evolved out of Yuji Horii previous game, a classical PC adventure called the Portopia Serial Murder Case. Conceptually, the Sword of Hope simply rewinds some of Dragon Quest's divergence and advancements from its predecessor. The top-down point of view reverts back to a screen-by-screen first-person perspective, and the world becomes once again smaller, yet more information-dense. The resulting game is actually pretty interesting. The Sword of Hope definitely has some flaws. Combat results can be wildly random, with the same attacks against the same enemy doing massively different amounts of damage from turn to turn. Not only that, but however strong the protagonist grows, he never seems to gain much resistance to magic. Combine these two factors, and it's entirely possible for you to find yourself utterly devastated by a single unlucky random attack by a low-level mob, and the frequency with which this happens makes progression in the game beyond the halfway point downright maddening at times. Fortunately, the Sword of Hope is also fairly forgiving. When you die, you're simply sent back to the beginning point with all your items, experience, and progress intact. And the world is fairly small too, though the frequency with which random encounters occur can make travel a chore at times. That being said, Sword of Hope does an admirable job of trying to keep things approachable. In fact, it doesn't even have totally random encounters. You can actually see enemies on the minimap, and there's some element of movement as enemies travel while you spend turns exploring or fighting. This can result in Etrian Odyssey-like moments, where a battle is joined by other enemies roaming nearby, which is an interesting touch. It also does that Doom thing where enemies of different species are as likely to attack one another as they are to wail on poor Prince Theo. It's actually an advantage of sorts to go up against different enemy types within the same battle, as they'll often burn turns and weaken one another by trading blows instead of focusing on you. All of these are fairly unconventional and sophisticated ideas for an RPG of this vintage, especially one on Game Boy. Like the system's other RPG from 1989, the Final Fantasy Legend, the Sword of Hope is far more innovative than you might expect from such an early release on such a limited platform. And certainly the game suffers from Game Boy's limitations as well. The screen is far more cramped than SHADOWGATE, and the lack of a battery backup means you have to travel back to the start of the game to get a password whenever you want to call it a day. Yet despite these irritations, it's hard to think too badly of the Sword of Hope. Yes, it's primitive and decidedly unbalanced, but it's crazily ambitious for its time and system. Sword of Hope saw a sequel, which, unlike the first game, is available on the American 3DS Virtual Console. Kemco also compiled it into a dual-game cartridge for Game Boy in Japan nearly a decade later, and much more recently they produced a Japan-only remake of the game for mobile platforms. Clearly, the Sword of Hope hasn't been forgotten. And why would it be? After all, this clearly was a jumping-off point for Kemco, one of their very first RPGs. And these days, the company's business consists almost entirely of churning out new mobile RPGs on a more or less monthly basis. But back in history, between the Sword of Hope and Ghost Lion, Kemco was laying down a foundation for its future, something the company could focus on once those Western licenses dried up. For more surprisingly good RPGs, keep reading GameBoyWorld.com.